The autumn of 1944 settled over the interior of France with a layered silence that seemed specific to the last months of war. The wind in the river valley was pressed low by early frost and slid along roads and field edges toward the south. As it passed through vegetation not yet fully yellowed, it left a long, dry whisper in the leaves and stalks. This had been a zone of temporary German positions, supply depots and withdrawal routes. When American forces advanced several dozen kilometers in a matter of days, those structures were emptied almost overnight. What remained was a band of land that was neither a front line nor a secure rear. In that depth, there were no clear bursts of gunfire, no steady flow of vehicles, only a hollow quality in the air, as if the place lacked an owner. Now and then, a dull explosion rolled in from far away, its sound bent by the hills until it overlapped with its own echo. Anyone familiar with maps could have pointed at this band and named it for what it was, a gap created by misaligned front lines. For those who had to walk into it, it felt more like a region not yet assigned a definition, a place whose nature might shift without warning. Within this zone, where life had not yet grown back, a village had been left behind by the overlapping rhythms of retreat and liberation. Its narrow, stone-paved streets climbed the slope of a low hill. They wound past houses scattered on either side and led toward several barns ringed by trees. In the past weeks, the German troops had first taken away any usable labor and horses. Then, as American reconnaissance drew closer, most of the villagers were evacuated in haste. The path of their departure fanned out toward the south like the opening of a hand. They did not leave smoldering ruins behind them. They left the marks of lives cut off mid-gesture. Window frames stood half open. Chairs and tables were left at odd angles, as if someone had risen without finishing a movement. A metal bucket still sat by the well, with early sunlight's moisture clinging to its surface. No one had come back to pick it up. The village was so quiet it no longer sounded inhabited, yet it did not look truly abandoned either. It seemed to be waiting for something that had not yet arrived, whether rebuilding or destruction no one could say. Several kilometers behind the front line, American civil affairs vehicles came to a halt. This unit, folded into the Allied system, was tasked with improvised administration and relief in newly cleared areas. Their work was to restore basic civil order as soon as possible after German forces pulled out. Their movements depended tightly on the advance of the main combat units. This time the rhythm was off. The main drive had stalled on the northern wing. Civil affairs found their working area pushed forward on the map, nominally still behind the front, but closer than doctrine would have preferred. The terrain and road conditions turned the idea of safe distance into something blurry. Small German detachments still moved along the retreat routes and had not completely cleared the region. Within this miscalculation, Mary Wallace and a handful of caregivers responsible for registering and rescuing children were ordered to proceed on foot into the village. Their task was to confirm whether the children listed on their forms had been evacuated according to plan. In the first hour after entering the village, Mary understood that the hollowness here was not just the result of armies passing through. It came from a deeper kind of disorder. When she walked between the stone walls, her footsteps multiplied. The echo did not sound like the muffled life of a normal village. It sounded like the empty interior of a large building, a stretch of corridor in a place built for more people than it contained. At a street corner, she saw a house whose door stood ajar, children's clothes still hanging on a chair inside. In a barn, she found sacks of grain piled carefully, ready to be moved, and then forgotten in the rush. She traced these signs back against the records in her hand, and recognized names of families she had seen on registration sheets. She saw no adults. The suggestion that the children may already have been taken away with the others was easy to voice as a hypothesis. Mary rejected it before anyone finished the sentence. The forms were unambiguous. Several children had been listed as too ill, too sensitive to cold, or too difficult to transport to be moved in the first wave. They were to remain temporarily, to be picked up when vehicles and time allowed. Mary examined each house with an insistence close to certainty. Any detail overlooked, any corner not checked, was to her a reenactment of loss, a second failure she would not permit. Her instinct to protect had formed long before she came to France. It had not been given to her by training manuals or regulations. It had settled in her over the course of years. After one loss and then another wore away any illusion that the world would ever take care of its own. She did not ask soldiers for their opinion. She did not weigh warnings on the scale of prudence. When the men from civil affairs and the escorting infantry reminded her that the area might still be touched by German stragglers, she answered briefly and kept walking. Young soldiers often found themselves responding to her with a mixture of emotions. They respected her lack of fear. They also held back from her, unable to understand the hardness in her manner. They knew that frontline advances were full of variables. They had learned the habit of caution, the reflex to imagine ambush in every gap. Mary seemed unwilling to accept any of that. At times, in the dry steadiness of her face, there was something like contempt for the soldiers' carefulness. In her view, the children did not have the luxury of waiting for a second chance. She did not have the luxury of choosing again. By late afternoon, she had confirmed that the remaining children were indeed clustered in several houses whose shutters had not fully been closed. The sky began to sink into early darkness. The main civil affairs convoy, delayed by mud and damaged bridges, could not reach the village at the planned time. From the south came the distant thud of artillery, proof that German remnants were still somewhere in motion. The American officers decided there was no sense in exposing an unarmored administrative unit in this zone any longer than necessary. They would pull back to a rally point a few kilometers away and wait until cross-country vehicles could pass. Mary refused to withdraw. Her reasoning was blunt enough to leave no gap for argument. The children could not be moved safely in the dark. She would not leave them unattended in an empty village. The young soldiers hesitated. In the end, they left her only the barest necessities, food, blankets, a lantern, and took the rest of their equipment with them. When they turned back on the road and looked over their shoulders, they saw a single light glowing in a house high on the slope. That was the shelter Mary had chosen for the children she had already gathered. In the still streets and the long shadow of the hill, that weak lamp looked isolated and fragile. As the night closed its grip around the village, Mary felt a faint change in the air. The wind that had come from the south all day shifted to the north. It brought with it the smell of soil that had been recently turned damp and raw. That was how she had learned to recognize marching formations on the roads beyond the stone walls. The rhythm of hobnails on hard ground reached her, faint, uneven, but unmistakable to an ear that had listened to too many convoys. The cadence was wrong for American boots. A small German infantry platoon was advancing along one of the secondary roads that branched off the main retreat route and past the edge of the village. At the same time, the distance between them and Mary shrank to less than a few dozen meters of dark air and stone. The space around her narrowed from emptiness into shadow filled with possibilities she could not name. The night had not yet broken open, but it was already tightening. She was the one person in the village who had no way to step aside. Night fell on this country earlier now than in other seasons. Clouds from a westward low-pressure front spread over the hills, pressing the village beneath an uneven lid of darkness. The roads and ditches remained as faint outlines, their borders blurred as humidity rose, as if the landscape itself were undecided where anything began or ended. The German platoon moved along the side road, following the pattern they had used on every retreat. Their boots tapped the gravel in a dense, dotted rhythm. Each man heard his own steps and everyone else's. The echoes overlapped and stretched. On this ground, each echo sounded heavy and slow, as if other formations were marching beside them, invisible in the dark. The men no longer trusted their ears to distinguish what was close and what was reflected. The purpose of this movement was not to fight. It was to get away from the pressure of the Allied advance as quickly as possible. They moved in their usual withdrawal formation. The column was drawn out. Light machine gun teams and men carrying heavier loads were interspersed through the line. They kept the minimum of guard posts on their flanks. The pressure they felt came less from the task and more from everything around it. The front had collapsed in too many places in too short a time. They had lost the continuity of supply, the weight of clear orders, even the familiar reference points of the terrain. Under such conditions, soldiers became swollen with a fear that exceeded the actual probability of ambush. Every slight change in the slope of the road, every irregular clearing in the trees, every broken segment of stone wall had to be read as a possible signal of danger. When the platoon reached the outer edge of the village, they heard no gunfire. They saw no muzzle flashes. They heard something else. From somewhere near the center of the village came the faint but distinct sound of metal against wood. It repeated at irregular intervals. Sometimes it seemed higher, sometimes lower, as if the source were moving through different floors of a building. The corporal in charge of scouting halted and raised his hand. He held his breath and listened. The empty band of land that had seemed so harmless by day showed its other side at night. The stone walls, the roof tiles, the damp ground, the speed of the wind all combined to break and scatter sound. The corporal did not hear a single precise point. He heard 3, then 4, then 5 weak points at once, appearing and fading in different corners of his hearing. This effect did not require an actual enemy squad. It required only a person moving through buildings with metal objects in their hands. It required an environment built to magnify and confuse. For a unit that had been retreating for weeks, that distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that the pattern felt intentional. It smelled like tactics. At that same moment, Mary was trying to move the children from the more exposed parts of the village into positions where there would be more walls between them and whatever walked outside. In one house, where the kitchen still held pots and pans on hooks, she searched for anything she could use as a marker. When the edge of a lid struck the corner of the table, it rang with a short, sharp note. She winced at the sound but did not imagine it would travel far. She did not strike the metal to attract attention. She struck it to let the 2 children she had not yet found know where she was. She lit the lamp just for a moment, then blew it out again. She wanted the inner rooms to appear briefly so that any child peering from a doorway would see the outline and move toward it. From outside, those same flickers looked like lights changing position, like signals being passed from window to window. In the eyes of men ready for ambush, this was enough to hint at fire teams shifting. The platoon leader listened to the corporal's report and kept the column where it was. He had marched at night too often to believe that the worst danger was the enemy he could see. The worst danger was a source of noise he could not size or locate. He remembered the previous weeks when they had been pinned and harassed by partisans in both eastern and western sectors. Those small bands had learned to use town streets and folds in the ground to produce acoustic illusions. They made a handful of rifles sound like a larger unit. They made scattered noises seem coordinated so that retreating troops would overestimate their strength. In that light, he felt his mind bend almost automatically. The irregular clinks, the moving lamps, the intermittent doors all slid into a familiar pattern. This was a place where irregular forces had taken up positions. If partisans or American scouts were already in the village, charging through would mean letting themselves be chopped into separate groups between the walls. Fire would break them apart before they could respond as a single unit. None of this came from fresh intelligence. It came from weeks of being hunted, weeks in which caution had become a reflex that replaced thought. Mary moved back and forth through the streets. She carried the smallest child in her arms, pushing doors open with her shoulder. Her steps were steady, but there was a lag in them now, a drag of exhaustion. The street was quiet enough that each door latch she lifted sounded like a sudden crack of wood. Every time a door closed behind her, the sound bounced between the fronts of the houses and returned as something louder than the original. She had no other means to work with. She could not take all the children at once. She could not leave them to find their own way in a village that no longer looked like home. Her plan was simple. If she could bring them all into the same structure, one that offered at least 2 layers of walls and rooms, she could build a makeshift shield around them. What she did not know was that the gathering itself was creating all the conditions the soldiers needed in order to misread the village. The German soldiers, still crouched at the edge of the houses, became aware that the wind had shifted again. The north wind now carried the interior sounds more clearly into their position. The pathways of sound stabilized. What had been a scattering of echoes sharpened into several recurring points. Younger men began whispering among themselves, exchanging what each thought he had seen or heard. One murmured that he had seen a light flash in a window and then appear in another, lower opening seconds later. Another swore he had caught 3 identical metallic sounds in a row, as if someone were giving a code. A third was sure he had heard wood splinter not far from where he imagined a side street to be. Any one of these details, taken alone, was too weak to carry a conclusion. Layered together, in the dark, in an area no one trusted, they settled into place as proof. The platoon leader noticed the change in voices and posture along the line. He sensed how quickly imagination could mutate into panic. He had never believed that coincidences gathered like this by chance. If the retreating unit forced itself through that village, he thought, it would almost certainly walk into ground, chosen by someone else. They were already tired. Their reaction times were slower. If an enemy occupied the higher buildings, the platoon would be moving inside a narrow field of fire with no good exit. He did not need to decide if the enemy really existed. He only needed to decide what would happen if they did. Within the barns, Mary laid most of the children in the deepest corner, among sacks and old tools. She wrapped blankets around them, tucking fabric under their chins so they would not shiver and betray their hiding place with involuntary sounds. Then she returned alone to the street. She was still missing one child. She thought the girl might be hiding near the small square, where houses stood closer together, and the lamps had been left unlit. The gravel under her soles snapped in the windless dark. The noise sat close to her like another presence. She knew it was an illusion, the mind filling in what the eyes could not see, but that knowledge did not cancel the feeling. She pushed open another half-closed door. The faint light behind her stretched into the room, outlining chairs pushed out of place and drawers left open. By touch, she traced the dust on the tabletop and felt fresh grooves, the marks of objects moved in the past day or two. She guessed the child might be crouched behind a piece of furniture. She moved a chair gently, murmuring, hoping not to startle anyone. These small movements were reshaped by the stone and timber into brittle notes that flew much farther than she imagined. In the depression outside the village, the platoon felt their formation tighten of its own accord, knees pressed into mud. Fingers curled harder around the grips of rifles. Breath shortened. Several soldiers began proposing their own reconstructions of what was happening inside. "There must be at least a dozen of them," one said. "They are moving in teams," another added. "The lights are signals. The repeated noises are orders." They described machine gun crews probing lines of sight. They sketched in whispers and gestures positions that did not exist. None of these images belonged to the real village. They belonged to the structure fear had built in each man's head. In that structure, any unknown opponent had to be multiplied until he justified the dread he caused. It was easier to believe in too many enemies than in the possibility that the risk might be smaller than their terror. The leader spread his map open against his thigh and traced an alternate route with his finger. To bypass the village, they would have to pass through an orchard, then climb a shallow slope and circle back to the main road. That would cost them at least an extra hour and a half of marching. But it would spare them a fight in confined streets where they could neither bring their weapons to bear properly nor retreat in good order. He weighed the meaning of this retreat against his orders. The mission now was not to hold ground, but to preserve what was left of the unit. In that light, the question of whether the enemy inside the village was real or imagined became secondary. Mary still did not know that someone out there was interpreting her actions as an organized threat. She knew only that the children nearest her were breathing faster. The older ones had reached the point where fear made their bodies shake. She took several of them into the farthest pocket of the barn and the adjoining cellar. She sat with them until their breathing steadied, then slipped away again. She had no weapon, no uniform, no rank. The only authority she recognized was the fact that there was no one else left to stand in this place between the children and the night. She re-entered the street and realized something she had only half noticed before. Each time she struck metal or dragged an object, the walls around her gave a lower, delayed answer. The sound did not simply die out. It went out, hit the stone, and came back changed. In that moment, the idea formed in her mind with unusual clarity. The signals she was using to call the children were traveling much farther than she wanted. They were going out beyond the village into places none of the children could reach. She understood then that she was not simply marking herself for those she wanted to protect. She was announcing herself to anyone listening in the dark. The first time that night she felt hesitation. It was brief, but it cut across the certainty that had driven her from house to house. To go on searching was to go on enlarging the circle of sound and light centered on her. To stop was to accept that some children might remain scattered out of her reach. The choice did not present itself in such clean words. It arrived as a harsh inner conclusion. She realized that she had been trying to protect the children by pulling them toward her, as if safety could only exist within arm's length. Now she recognized another possibility. Perhaps the only way to protect them was to let them slip completely out of sight, to become nothing in the eyes of whoever approached, while she remained as the single point that could not be ignored. Her understanding of protection turned in that instant. It moved from possession to sacrifice. She stopped going deeper into the streets. She returned instead to a spot where the houses opened out just enough that sound could travel clearly. She began to act in a new, deliberate way. She chose metal objects that made a clean, recognizable note. She struck them at measured intervals, always from the same place. She kept the lamp dark in the houses where the children lay. She used it only near herself, turning it on for a second, off again, always in the same narrow range of windows and doors. In doing this, she made herself into a fixed, bright mistake. She concentrated every sign of life on her own position. She allowed the rest of the village to fade into silence. On the low ground, the soldiers registered the change at once. The scattered echoes resolved into a single, steadier source. The metal sounds came from one direction now, each one following a pause like a breath taken between commands. This regularity confirmed their suspicions rather than easing them. To men who had been taught that enemies grew sharper at night, such clarity meant readiness. They believed now that the enemy was no longer moving about in a loose search. He had gathered in. He was preparing. The platoon leader read the pattern as the opening stage of an organized defense. He filled in the blanks with what he knew from training and from previous ambushes. The rest required no imagination. He issued the order his instinct had been pressing towards since they reached the village boundary. The platoon would not go through the streets. It would bypass the village entirely. He spoke without drama. His tone was compressed, as if the decision had only one possible form left. The column peeled away from the road and slid into the black of the orchard. Branches brushed against uniforms. Mud closed over the marks their boots left behind. Mary stood in the middle of the street and felt the absence that followed. The pressure of listening eyes and ears withdrew. The air seemed to move more freely again, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from the walls. She did not know whether the soldiers had passed, or whether they had simply stopped. She knew only that the village no longer rang back at her in the same way. Her chest rose and fell with the accumulated strain of the night. There was no sensation of victory in her body. There was no sense of narrow escape. What she felt instead was a weary recognition, a realization that came from someplace deeper than relief. She understood that whatever strength she had did not lie in keeping hold of the children. It lay in being willing to stand alone where she could be seen, so they did not have to be. The orchard swallowed the last of the platoon's outlines. They continued north, up along the slope, their figures merging with the darkness that had always felt more honest to them than any reassuring word. No one turned to check whether there had truly been an enemy in the village. No one questioned the leader's choice. At night, decisions rarely rested on verified facts. They rested on the weight of uncertainty. The platoon leader knew that he had avoided one village. He would never know that he had walked around an unarmed woman instead of around a trap. His choice spared his men from a confrontation that would likely never have happened. Mary's persistence kept the children from ever coming into the soldiers' line of sight at all. Both sides made their decisions in the dark, guided by guesses and private fears. Neither side ever knew what the other had really been. When the last trace of marching died into distance, the village returned to what looked like silence. Mary remained at the corner of the street, breath catching high in her chest. In the barn and cellar, the children slept lightly, turning over in their blankets, unaware that the night had bent around them. She did not feel herself as a guardian in that moment. She felt only the absence of her own former life. She had lost a daughter. She had lost youth, family, the ordinary future that should have followed those things. All of that loss had hollowed her out until there was no retreat left in her. That emptiness, she now understood, was what had allowed her to stand where she did. She had nothing she could be forced to protect for herself. That made her free in a way the armed men outside the village were not. Toward dawn, the wind eased. The night's tightness let go its hold on the roofs and walls. The flow of air inside the streets steadied. Mary turned back toward the barn. Her steps were so light they made no sound at all on the stone. The quiet itself was the result of everything she had done in the hours before. Dawn unfolded behind the hills, pale and colorless at first. Light slid slowly down the valley and into the village, thinned by mist, until the houses rose like shapes pressed up under wet paper. An American reconnaissance detachment advanced along the main road toward the village. They had been told they might find shell craters, collapsed walls, the scorched marks left when positions changed hands in the dark. Instead, the streets seemed almost unnaturally intact. No buildings had fallen, no walls had been broken. There were no burned-out vehicles, no black circles on the road. Only the wet impressions on the ground and a few pieces of furniture shifted out of place suggested that the night had not been as blank as it looked. At the edge of the square, the soldiers stopped. A door across the way was opening slowly. Mary stepped out from the shadow. There was no triumph in her face, no tears of exhaustion breaking free. Her expression was that of someone who had finished a hard task and had not yet decided what to feel about it. The light fell across her shoulders. It made her look as if she had been pulled up out of somewhere deep, rather than as if she had simply stepped through a doorway. She did not offer explanations. She did not tell them about the footsteps or the way the sound had filled the village. She raised her hand and pointed toward the barns and the entrance to the cellar. The soldiers followed her gesture. Inside, they found the children asleep or blinking themselves awake, breathing evenly in the grey light. For them, the world had not shrunk or expanded in the night. It had simply gone dark and then bright again. The Americans quickly realized that something about this place did not match the usual pattern. Villages this close to shifting lines were rarely left untouched. They walked the streets in pairs, noting the traces of movement, the coals of extinguished lamps, doors that had clearly been opened and closed too often in one night. They sketched the layout in their notebooks. One young soldier lingered beside a wall and clapped his hand lightly against the stone. The echo came back to him thickened and broken. He tried it again and listened to how the sound crawled along the buildings. Looking at the map and the ground together, he guessed that people moving here at night might easily misjudge how many others were in motion. He mentioned the possibility of a misreading having taken place. Then he put down his pencil and turned away. He did not take the thought far enough to imagine a single unarmed woman at the center of all of it. In the written report, the reconnaissance team left behind, their language remained flat. The village intact. No enemy contact. No exchange of fire. The file carried no entries capable of explaining why a retreating German unit had chosen to go around a town with no armed opposition inside it. Paper was rarely good at recording the weight of hypotheticals. Mary did not step forward to claim any exceptional status that morning. She sat at the barn entrance and watched the children wake up one by one. Some rubbed their eyes and looked around with the unfocused stare of those who had been moved while asleep. Others clung to blankets or to one another, then relaxed when they saw familiar faces. Mary knew she had done all that was in her power to do. She knew, more sharply than before, that none of it had anything to do with saving the village as such. Her work that night had not been to preserve stone walls or streets. It had been to make sure that the children did not vanish into the dark the way her daughter once had. For the first time, she allowed herself to put a name to what she had learned. Protection was not the same as holding on. It meant that once danger had passed, those who had been hidden could walk forward into a future that did not revolve around her fear. Years later, memories of that night would drift apart into shapes that no longer matched one another. German survivors would speak of having skirted an occupied village somewhere in France during the retreat. They remembered points of light, faint clinks of metal, and a fear they could never fully measure. They never learned that they had reacted to the echo of a single person's movements. American archive boxes would contain the dry note that the village had not experienced enemy contact. The language was so calm, it suggested that nothing at all had happened. No document explained why a tired, anxious platoon had declined to use the most direct route. The children who had lain in the barn and cellar that night would grow to adulthood with thin, incomplete recollections. They remembered footsteps and light and the feel of her hand leading them into deeper rooms. Then they remembered quiet. That was all. Mary's life after the war did not curve toward medals or commemorations. She stayed in the organizations that tended to civilians after armies had passed through. She did work that drew no more attention than filling in forms or lifting crates. She almost never spoke of that night. On the rare occasions when someone pressed her and she could not deflect the question, she gave a single sentence and no more. "I didn't protect the village," she would say. "I just stood in front of the children." The line became the closest thing to a summary she ever allowed to exist. She never unpacked it. It was not modesty. It was not a refusal to admit what she had done. It arose from a deeper understanding that words could not shape for anyone who had not stood where she had stood. She knew she had not driven an enemy back. She had not won a victory. She had simply made herself into the only visible fact in a space where visibility meant danger. She moved the children out of the line of sight, not out of the world. Their lives continued in directions she could never follow. In the end, the nature of that night was worn thin by time. What remained, more clearly than any precise account, was a paradox. Industrial war was supposed to be decided by weight of fire and by the reach of machines. Yet, at its darkest edges, the decisive choice fell to someone with no weapon, no reserve, and nothing left that could be taken from her. Soldiers had not feared her strength. They had feared the depth of her emptiness, the way it allowed her to hold her ground without any thought of herself. They skirted not the village, but that unyielding posture. They turned away from a presence they could not name, and in walking around it, they left the children untouched. Mary never pushed back a single assault. She never fired a shot. Yet she caused a platoon to give up the shortest path. In war, the hardest things to interpret are rarely the guns. They are the acts of people who have already lost everything of their own and now live only to shield others. The official record of the village reduced that night to a single dry line. Houses intact, civilians present, no engagement. Everything that truly happened lay outside that sentence, in the space no report could reconstruct. In that space, Mary Wallace left behind nothing more than a silhouette, a figure moving alone through the dark. It was enough to make an armed unit turn aside. It was enough to give a group of children a whole, unbroken morning,